She could have taken everything, but instead she chose honesty. When a homeless black girl finds a millionaire's unlimited credit card, no one expects what happens next. Humiliated and judged for her appearance, she faces racism and rejection, until one decision changes everything. Subscribe now, share this video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The city hummed with life. Steam rose from subway grates, mixing with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the pungent fumes of exhaust. Neon signs flickered above crowded sidewalks where sharply dressed professionals hurried past street vendors selling pretzels and roasted nuts. Amidst the noise and movement, a small figure weaved carefully through the crowd. Amara clutched a torn backpack against her chest, her oversized jacket hanging loosely from her thin frame. She looked no older than 10, yet her eyes held a weight that made her seem older. Eyes that had seen too many nights curled up on cardboard mats and too many mornings scavenging for scraps. Her shoes, worn to the soles, slapped softly against the pavement as she followed her father, Darnell, who moved with the cautious determination of a man always expecting to be turned away. Their morning had begun like most others, waking under the highway overpass where they had spent the night, brushing dirt off their clothes, and heading toward the recycling bins behind the cafes and office buildings. Darnell's hands, rough and calloused, sorted through bottles and cans, while Amara scanned the ground for loose change or anything they could trade for food. It was Amara who spotted it. The glint of gold caught her eye between the cracks in the pavement near a newspaper stand. She bent down, brushing aside a discarded cup, and froze. It was a credit card, pristine despite the grime of the sidewalk. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, eyes widening when she read the name engraved on it, Alexander Hartman. Even Amara, despite her young age, had heard the name before. Hartman was one of the richest men in the city, his face often appearing on billboards and magazine covers. Her father approached, his brow furrowed as he saw her expression. "What is it, baby girl?" Amara held up the card, her heart pounding. "Look, Daddy, it's his." Darnell took the card, turning it over in his hands. He exhaled sharply. "Hartman?" Amara nodded. Her first thought had been food. With this card, they could eat, really eat. No more stale bread or half-eaten sandwiches pulled from trash bins. No more sleeping in the cold, huddled under thin blankets. For the first time in weeks, they could have a meal that didn't taste like desperation. But even as the thought formed, she heard her father's voice echo in her mind. "We don't take what isn't ours, Amara, no matter how hungry we are." Darnell's face was hard to read as he inspected the card. "What do we do?" Amara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father knelt in front of her, his tired eyes steady and calm. "We return it," he said. "But, no buts, baby girl." He tucked the card into the pocket of his worn jacket. "Doing the right thing's easy when it's easy. It's harder when you're hungry. That's when it matters most." Amara swallowed hard, pushing down the lump in her throat. "I trust you, Daddy." And so they began walking. The streets blurred past them. High-rise towers with glass windows that reflected the sun, shop windows full of clothes and jewelry that seemed more like dreams than things real people wore. Amara couldn't help but stare at the kids her age walking with their parents, dressed in bright coats and shiny shoes. She wondered if they ever felt hungry. If they ever had to sleep with one eye open to make sure no one stole their blanket. By the time they reached the towering building that bore Hartman's name, her legs ached and her stomach growled. The hotel's lobby gleamed like something out of a fairy tale, gold trim, chandeliers that glittered like diamonds, and carpets so clean that Amara hesitated to step on them. She clutched her father's hand as heads turned to stare at them. A woman at the front desk looked up, her eyes narrowing as she took in their ragged clothes. "Can I help you?" Her voice dripped with suspicion. "We need to speak to Mr. Hartman," Darnell said firmly. "We found something of his." The woman barely concealed her disdain. "I think you're in the wrong place," she replied. Darnell reached into his jacket and held up the card. The woman's eyes widened, but her expression quickly hardened. "Wait here," she said curtly, picking up the phone. Minutes passed. Amara shifted uncomfortably under the weight of stares from other guests. Then the doors to the elevator slid open, and a young man stepped out. Tall, blond, and dressed in an expensive suit, he moved through the room with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice sharp. "These two," the woman at the desk began, "claim they found your father's credit card." The man's eyes raked over Darnell and Amara, and his lips curled into a sneer. "Yeah? Or maybe they stole it and got scared when it didn't work." "That's not true," Amara blurted, but her voice shook. "Of course it's not," the man said mockingly. "And I'm sure you were just about to hand it over. No strings attached, right?" Darnell stepped in front of his daughter, shielding her from the man's glare. "We're here to return what isn't ours," he said evenly. "Save it," the man snapped. "I don't buy sob stories." Before Amara could respond, he pulled out his phone and snapped a picture. "Let's see what people think," he said, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Bet this'll get a lot of attention." "Caught in the act." Amara's cheeks burned. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back, gripping her father's hand. "We didn't steal anything," she whispered. The man laughed. "Tell it to someone who cares." Darnell grabbed Amara's hand and turned to leave, but not before the man called after them. "Get out of here, and don't come back." The security guards didn't even wait for instructions. They followed them out, their voices sharp and their hands firm. By the time Amara and Darnell stepped back onto the sidewalk, the tears she had been holding finally spilled over. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she said, choking back a sob. Darnell knelt down and held her. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said softly. "We did the right thing." "But it didn't matter." "It does," he insisted. "Maybe not to them, but to us. And one day it will matter to someone else, too." As they walked away, neither of them noticed the man in the suit watching them from the hotel window. Alexander Hartman had seen everything. And he was not pleased. The cold evening air gnawed at Amara's skin as she and Darnell walked away from the towering hotel. The hum of the city continued around them, indifferent to their humiliation. Neon lights flickered in puddles on the sidewalk, reflecting back distorted images of Amara's tear-streaked face. She wiped her eyes, but her father's grip on her hand stayed firm, steadying her steps. Darnell's shoulders were squared, his jaw tight, but Amara could see the weight pressing down on him. The cruel words and sharp stares from the hotel staff and the rich man's son lingered in her ears, louder than the traffic rumbling nearby. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice trembling, "why did they look at us like that?" Darnell slowed, pulling her gently to a stop beneath the dim glow of a streetlight. He crouched down, so their eyes were level, his tired gaze softened by the sight of her worry. "Because people see what they want to see, baby girl," he said. "They don't see you. They see your skin. They see these clothes, and they decide what kind of person you are before you even open your mouth." Amara's lips quivered. But we did the right thing. We gave it back." Darnell cupped her face, brushing his thumb over her cheek. "Doing the right thing doesn't always mean people will believe you," he said, "but it doesn't mean you stop trying." His words settled in her chest, warm and reassuring, but the ache of unfairness still burned deep. She thought of the blond man's sneer and the way he had treated them like dirt. Her father deserved better. They both did. They reached the edge of the block where their makeshift shelter waited, an alley tucked between two abandoned buildings. The sound of distant sirens echoed through the streets as Darnell laid down their worn blankets and pulled Amara close to keep her warm. She didn't sleep right away, her mind replaying the scene at the hotel over and over. She pictured the card, the smooth, golden surface that could have changed everything, and then she pictured the man in the suit, laughing at her tears. Her fists clenched. Someday, she thought, someday they'll see. Morning came with the sharp chill of dawn and the distant rumble of delivery trucks. Amara woke to the smell of stale bread as Darnell offered her the last crust from his pocket. Her stomach growled, but she shook her head. "You eat it, Daddy." He smiled faintly and tore the piece in two, handing her half. They ate in silence, their breaths visible in the cold. "We'll figure this out," Darnell said, more to himself than to her. But before he could stand, the faint sound of footsteps made them both look up. Across the street, the same blond man from the hotel, Tom, stood with his hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable. Darnell's body went rigid as Tom crossed the street and stopped a few feet away. "What do you want?" Darnell asked sharply, pulling Amara closer. Tom hesitated. "My father wants to talk to you," he said. Darnell's eyes narrowed. "Your father?" "Yes," Tom said, looking embarrassed. "He saw what happened yesterday. He's not happy about it." Darnell didn't move. "Why should we trust anything you say?" Tom flushed. "Look, I'm sorry, all right? I didn't know he was watching. I didn't know he cared, but he does. And he told me to come find you." Darnell exchanged a glance with Amara, then nodded reluctantly. The lobby felt even colder the second time they entered. The stairs followed them just as before, but this time Tom led them past the front desk and straight to an elevator. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as they rose higher and higher. Alexander Hartman was waiting for them in a sleek office that smelled faintly of leather and polished wood. He was older than Tom, with graying hair and sharp eyes that studied them closely. "Mr. Darnell, Miss Amara," he said, his voice deep and steady, "thank you for coming." Darnell stayed tense, his arm protectively around his daughter. "I'd say it's our pleasure," he replied, "but I think you know it isn't." Hartman's expression didn't change. "You're right," he said. "I saw what happened yesterday, and I need to apologize for my son's behavior and for the way you were treated by my staff." Tom flinched beside him, but Hartman's focus stayed on Darnell. "I can't change what happened, but I can offer to make things right. I want to help you." Darnell's jaw tightened. "We don't need charity." Hartman raised a hand. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering an opportunity." He turned to Tom. "My son needs to learn something about the world, about people, about what it means to struggle." Tom's head snapped up. "Dad?" "No," Hartman interrupted. "You had your chance to prove yourself yesterday, and you failed. Now you're going to learn what it's like to be on the other side." He looked back at Darnell. "I want Tom to spend the next 24 hours living the way you do. No money, no phone, no connections. And when it's over, I want him to come back here and tell me what he's learned." Darnell hesitated, then met Hartman's gaze. "And what about us?" "If you'll let me," Hartman said, "I'll make sure you're not sleeping on the streets after this. But it has to be your choice." Darnell studied the man carefully before nodding. "All right." Tom's first hour on the street hit him harder than he expected. People ignored him. Others stared openly, their gazes sharp and judgmental. He tried to enter a cafe, only to be turned away by the manager. The humiliation stung, but what hurt more was the hunger gnawing at his stomach. As the sun dipped lower, he found himself in the same alley where Darnell and Amara had spent the night. He sank down against the wall, shivering. "This is what they go through?" he muttered to himself. The hours dragged. He met others, people who offered him scraps of food and blankets without hesitation, even though they had so little themselves. An older man shared a piece of bread with him, and a young mother gave him half of her sandwich while her child slept beside her. By the time morning came, Tom's clothes were dirty, his body ached, and his pride was in tatters. But for the first time, he understood. He found Darnell and Amara near the shelter and knelt in front of them. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry for what I said, for what I did. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Darnell didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at his daughter, who studied Tom carefully. "Do you believe him?" Darnell asked her. Amara nodded slowly. "Yes." And with that single word, Tom's journey to redemption began. The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over the streets that had, for the past day, been Tom's home. His body ached from sleeping on the hard concrete, his stomach churned with hunger, and his pride felt as battered as the clothes he now wore. Yet, as he stood before Darnell and Amara, something inside him had shifted. The words of apology had come out raw, almost fragile, but they hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Darnell's sharp gaze held Tom in place, measuring him, weighing the sincerity in his voice. "You think one night out here makes you understand?" Darnell's tone was even, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. Tom flinched. "No," he admitted. "Not everything, but I understand enough to know I was wrong." He turned to Amara, whose dark eyes studied him carefully. Her small hands clutched the edges of her worn jacket, but something in her expression softened. "You really mean it?" she asked. Tom nodded, his throat tightening. "I do." The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the faint clang of a garbage truck somewhere down the street. Finally, Darnell straightened, his shoulders relaxing just enough to show he was ready to give Tom a chance. "All right," he said, "you've apologized. Now, let's see what you do with it." Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but the weight of expectation settled just as quickly on his shoulders. He had been given an opportunity, one he knew he couldn't afford to waste. Back at the Hartman residence, Alexander waited in his office. He rose as Tom entered, his sharp eyes taking in the disheveled state of his son. The transformation was undeniable. Gone was the polished arrogance, replaced by a weariness that hinted at deeper changes. "Well?" Alexander asked, crossing his arms. Tom hesitated, struggling to put the experience into words. "It was harder than I thought," he said finally. "I didn't realize how invisible people are out there. How easy it is to look right through them." Alexander nodded. "And what do you intend to do about it?" Tom swallowed, then met his father's gaze. "I want to help them," he said. "Not just Amara and Darnell, but all the people I met out there. They need more than just a handout. They need jobs, homes, a chance to start over." Alexander's expression remained unreadable for a moment before a flicker of approval passed through his eyes. "Good," he said, "because I've been thinking about that too." It didn't take long for plans to take shape. Alexander called Darnell and Amara back to the hotel, this time meeting them in a more private and welcoming space. They were wary at first, but when Alexander laid out his proposal, their skepticism gave way to cautious hope. "We want to start a foundation," Alexander explained, gesturing toward Tom, "not just to provide shelter, but to create opportunities, job training programs, affordable housing, and resources for families who are struggling." Darnell folded his arms. "And where do we fit into this?" Alexander met his gaze steadily. "We need your help," he said. "You've lived it. You know better than anyone what it's like and what people actually need." Darnell didn't respond right away. His eyes shifted to Amara, who sat quietly beside him, her fingers tracing patterns in the fabric of the chair. "I don't know," Darnell said finally. "We've spent so long just trying to survive. What if this doesn't work?" "It will," Tom said, speaking up for the first time, "because we won't stop until it does." His words hung in the air, and slowly Darnell nodded. "All right," he said, "but we're doing this together." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Plans turned into blueprints, and blueprints turned into construction sites. Tom threw himself into the work, visiting shelters, speaking with community leaders, and learning from people like Darnell who had lived through struggles he'd never even considered before. Darnell, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. With his insight and connections among the homeless community, he became an advisor to the foundation, ensuring that every decision made addressed real needs. Amara, meanwhile, became the foundation's unofficial ambassador. Her story spread quickly, inspiring donations and support from people all over the city. She visited schools, shelters, and fundraisers, sharing her experience with a mix of vulnerability and hope that left no one untouched. And yet, despite the progress, not everything was smooth. One evening, Tom sat alone in the foundation's office, papers spread out across the desk. His phone buzzed, a news alert. When he opened it, his stomach sank. Graffiti had been spray-painted across one of the new shelters under construction. Words like "keep them out" and "no bums here" were scrawled across the walls in angry red letters. Tom slammed his fist against the desk. "All this work," he muttered, "and they still don't get it." Darnell found him there a short while later, pacing the room. "It's just paint," Darnell said. Tom whirled on him. "No, it's not. It's—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "It's hate. It's everything I used to be." Darnell studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "It is hate. But you can't fight hate with anger." Tom exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "Then how?" Amara's voice cut through the tension. "We paint over it." Both men turned to see her standing in the doorway. "We paint over it," she repeated. "And we invite everyone, neighbors, volunteers, the people who need the shelter. We show them that we're not going anywhere." Tom's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "She's smarter than both of us," Darnell said. "Clearly." The painting day turned into something more than anyone had expected. Neighbors who had been skeptical about the shelters showed up with brushes in hand. Formerly homeless men and women stood shoulder to shoulder with community leaders, turning hateful messages into colorful murals of hope and unity. And as Tom stood among them, watching Amara laugh with a group of children as they painted flowers and stars over the graffiti, he felt something shift inside him again. This time, it wasn't guilt or shame. It was pride. By the end of the day, the shelter stood transformed. What had begun as a target for hate now stood as a symbol of resilience. Darnell placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "You did good today," he said. Tom looked at him, surprised by the words. "We all did," Tom replied. And as the sun set over the city, casting warm light across the vibrant murals, it felt, for the first time in a long time, like hope had found a home. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the freshly painted walls of the shelter. The murals, vibrant and full of life, stood as a testament to resilience. Flowers bloomed alongside outstretched hands and bright skies, erasing the hateful graffiti that had once marred the surface. The shelter had become more than just a building. It was a promise, a symbol of hope for those who had been forgotten. Tom stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as neighbors, volunteers, and former skeptics mingled. Conversations buzzed around him, plans for new projects, stories of lives already changed, and laughter that rang out like music. He smiled faintly, but the weight of responsibility pressed on his shoulders. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Tom turned to see Amara standing beside him, her dark eyes reflecting the warm glow of the lights strung above them. She looked different now, stronger, more confident. But there was still a spark of the little girl who had found a credit card and chosen honesty over desperation. "It is," he agreed, "and so are the people who made it happen." Amara tilted her head, studying him. "You're one of them, you know." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know about that." "You should." Her voice was firm, and Tom couldn't help but smile. In the weeks following the shelter's opening, the foundation's work expanded rapidly. Donations poured in, and volunteers showed up in droves. The once empty lots and abandoned buildings began to transform into safe spaces, places where people could eat, sleep, and start rebuilding their lives. Darnell became the face of the Foundation's outreach programs, his experiences lending authenticity and authority to their mission. His steady voice and unwavering commitment drew others in, showing them what was possible when dignity and hope replaced judgment and shame. Amara, meanwhile, captured hearts wherever she went. Her story inspired countless others to step forward and share their struggles. She visited schools and community centers, speaking about kindness and courage, always reminding people that change started with one small decision. Tom threw himself into the work, overseeing construction projects, attending city council meetings, and pushing through obstacles that once might have made him give up. He no longer flinched at the sight of dirty clothes or tired faces. Instead, he saw strength, determination, and potential in every person the Foundation helped. But the work wasn't without challenges. Late one evening, Tom sat alone in his office staring at blueprints spread out across his desk. The plans for the next shelter were ambitious. Too ambitious, some said. Permits were delayed, budgets stretched thin, and opposition from local businesses had grown louder. The weight of it all felt crushing. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." Amara stepped inside, her small frame dwarfed by the stacks of papers and files. "You're still here?" she asked. "Couldn't sleep," Tom admitted. "Worried?" He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah. Sometimes it feels like no matter how much we do, it's never enough." Amara crossed the room and perched on the edge of his desk. "It's not supposed to be easy," she said, "but that doesn't mean it's not worth it." Tom looked at her, amazed at the wisdom in her words. "How did you get so smart?" Amara shrugged. "I had a good teacher." Her words reminded Tom of Darnell, the man who had shown him what integrity looked like even in the face of hardship. "You're right," Tom said. "We keep going." The following weeks brought more victories. Construction resumed, and new shelters opened their doors. Programs for job training, mental health counseling, and legal support flourished, turning the foundation into a lifeline for those in need. The mural project that had started as an act of defiance spread across the city, transforming neglected spaces into vibrant expressions of hope. At one of the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, Alexander Hartman stood before the crowd, his voice steady as he addressed the audience. "My son came to me not long ago, asking for my help," he began. "At the time, I thought it was about fixing his mistakes, but I see now that it was about building something bigger than either of us, something that belongs to all of you." He gestured toward Tom, who stood with Amara and Darnell at the front of the crowd. "This foundation started because of one act of honesty," Alexander continued. "And it's grown because of courage, the courage to face mistakes, to learn from them, to fight for what's right." The applause was thunderous, but Tom barely heard it. He turned to Amara and Darnell, his chest tight with emotion. "We did this," he said softly. "No," Darnell corrected, "you did this. You proved us wrong, and I've never been happier to be wrong." As the celebration wound down, Tom found himself outside, staring up at the stars. Amara joined him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "What now?" she asked. Tom exhaled slowly, his breath curling in the cold night air. "Now we keep going. We help more people. We change more lives." Amara smiled. "Good." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the credit card, the same one she had found weeks ago. Tom raised an eyebrow. "You kept it?" "Yeah," she said, "not because of what it could buy, because of what it started." She pressed it into his hand. "Maybe you should keep it now." Tom looked at the card, the name gleaming under the streetlights. Then he slipped it into his pocket. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "For what?" "For showing me what really matters." The city around them felt different that night. It wasn't just the murals or the new shelters, it was the people. They weren't invisible anymore. They had names, stories, and a place to belong. And so did Tom. As he walked away with Amara by his side, he felt the weight of his past lift. It wouldn't be easy. The work would never be finished. But for the first time he wasn't afraid, because now he understood that even the smallest acts of kindness, returning a lost card, sharing a piece of bread, painting over hate, could change the world. And that was enough. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and leave comments. Your thoughts are important. Watch the next and other videos on the channel for even more inspiring stories.